Um, all right, so just by way of introduction, I am very excited to welcome Aamer Hussein to our IBA class, and I'm very grateful as well. I think these students are very, very lucky. I wish I had such opportunities at their age. And he's a writer, scholar, critic, columnist, and he's joining us today from London. He has several short stories collections to his credit, and also two novels, another called Mohar Tree and The Cloud Messenger. His latest book, titled Restless Instead of an Autobiography, has just been released and is available in Pakistan. So the first question, we will have it as a question and answer. And if any one of you has anything pressing to add in the middle, please join in, but you will have a separate question and answer round at the end. So my first question to you is, we have a class of mostly 18-year-olds over here, and some of them are just discovering themselves as writers. So why writing? Why is it even important? Why should they pursue it or look forward to it?
Writing is important first and foremost because I think to some extent we're all readers. We're formed by what we read from a very early age. And even those of us who don't read are formed by orality, which is informed by some written text. And in order to create those texts for people to read, we have to write. I don't think it has to be a vocation for everyone. But you know, someone who's a firm, sort of a passionate reader will at some point find themselves inclined perhaps to write. And that's the reason. But you write because you have something to say, something to express, because you want to add your voice to the voices of the world. There's every reason and no reason. I don't think it's an essential activity, but it's certainly a beautiful one. What more can one say?
It is. And you do it.
We have the need to tell stories. Everyone has a need to tell a story.
Yes, everyone has a story, you're right. And a sort of connected question. They're all mostly business majors. Should they be writing?
I'm sorry?
They're all mostly business majors. It's a sort of connected question. Should they value writing?
Well, if you value reading, then you have to value writing too. Because I mean, you read what's written. So the two words, I think, go together all the time. Anyone who loves a book has to know that the book has to be written at some point. And even if it's someone else's story told by the author, it still has to be written.
Right.
So that's the only way I can answer it. I mean, it's a conundrum, the question.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about what we've been doing as a class together. One of the first writing tasks I did was to write about a childhood memory.
Yeah.
And what is the nature of memories in your perspective, and how do we as writers mold this resource to our benefit?
Well, memory and imagination have a very, very strong relationship. You know, in Urdu, they say choli daman ka saath. They go hand in hand. Because memory fuels the imagination. I don't think there's any such thing as pure imagination. I know a lot of people, particularly writers of fantasy and science fiction, get very upset with me for saying this. But our imagination is very much based on material facts. It's what we see, what we hear, what we feel, what we perceive, what we remember. And it can be based on bits and pieces of what we've seen or observed. And, you know, particularly with this very visual age that we have, in which we're bombarded with, you know, Netflix and cable TV and people watching films on their phones and all sorts of stuff. All that forms and feeds our imagination. Memory, of course, is a deeper bank of what we've been through ourselves, if you want to look at it in a more physical, biological way. That is our own experience from birth to death and whom we meet, what matters to us. So obviously it's very important to us, but in fiction, of course, there's a need very often to transform memory and also to deny memory and say that everything is imagined or structured according to an inventive design. and not according to what you remember. It's almost as if you want to deny the I that sees or the I that speaks and make it into something else. That's part of the art of fiction. I personally don't believe that we should be so categoric about separating what is remembered and what is real from what is supposedly imagined and invented. I hope that to some extent answers your question.
Yes, yes. And you say that we transform and sometimes we deny our memories, and all of that can be inspiration to write, can't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the denial in itself can be an inspiration to write. Like, these writers, I notice particularly a lot of Pakistani writers who say, I've never used an autobiographical word in my writing. But that's when you turn around and say, well, in a sense, everything is autobiographical, but I think that's tautological too. But it's not useful. It's not actually beneficial to anyone to say that one's own memories don't come into one's fiction, because even unconsciously, the train you sit in, the plane you take, the sky you see, the city you visit, the village you've forgotten, they all are part of memory. And in a story, they might not be part of some real recounting of your own, of the factual details of your life, but they're still there.
Yes, and in this class, we've been looking at personal narratives up till now, and they've been asked to work with real life instances and talk about those. And in doing so, sometimes I had the response that it's too personal to share in class, or it's too embarrassing. What do you suggest to that? What advice could you give them for those who feel that writing about their personal experiences is perhaps something they don't want to share, and yet they're writing about it? How do they face that dilemma?
Personal experiences don't necessarily have to be grand confessions of tragedy. They can be quite simple. They can be memories of other people, a parent, a family member, someone who works for you, a school friend, someone you barely knew, a trip you took. So it doesn't have to bear your soul necessarily. As far as soul bearing is concerned, I think we're all afraid of it. Having just written a book which is called Instead of an Autobiography, God, I know what it feels like to be apprehensive about bearing your soul. But if you're in a small contained group like yours is, how many students are you?
There's two. So in the mega class, they are 54, and in the other class, they are 27.
Yeah, I think that if you have a contained environment and you know that only those people in that classroom are going to listen to your experience, you can try to be bold enough to narrate something that you think will be significant. But the rest of the world is never going to know the difference between what is personal and what is invented, or what is half invented, or what is semi-autobiography or not autobiography at all. So that's all I can say. I mean, recently I had written about a very, very personal tragedy in a short story of mine that's in Restless. And a close friend of mine to whom I mentioned that event said, oh, I took it as just, part of a story, not something that would really happen. So that's also going to happen. People will look at your personal narratives if you don't call them a personal narrative. And they'll think it's just part of the fiction that you've created from, an assemblage of facts and imaginary events. But if you want to call it a personal narrative and you're brave enough to call it a personal narrative, that gives a kind of authenticity to the reader who feels that he can or she can experience along with you what you've written.
I see that. Talking about stories, in one of your talks, Art of the Story, you said not to shut the story in a box, because when you open the box, things leap out, and if you let them leap out at you, you'll find many, many different ways of telling stories.
Yeah.
This is inspiring, and yes, I just wanted to know, where does one draw one's ideas from? How do you imagine? How would they start writing?
Fiction? How would they start writing fiction?
No, they right now they're working at personal narratives.
Yeah, so
But
personal
yes,
narratives, I think I said it. I think it can begin from anywhere. It can begin from something that hurt you, something that made you happy, something that struck you as very significant. It can be a visual image, which is very often the way I start in a personal narrative or any narrative at all, with a visual image. It can be a verbal memory, some sort of sound or a line from a poem. Anything can get you going. And where did you hear the song? Who sang it? What feelings did it inspire in you? What were you doing at that moment in your life? Were you happy? Were you unhappy? Were you in love? How old were you? I'm just giving you one example.
so anything that moves you or inspires
Yeah,
you.
yeah, yeah. And anything you want to record, anything you want to memorialize, anyone you want to remember, someone who's gone perhaps, someone who's lost, someone whom the world will not remember unless you write about them. All these can be reasons to write a personal narrative. In fact, as I grow older, I'm more and more interested in personal narratives. And, personal narratives that are done creatively, not just in a boring, dull way, sequentially and chronologically.
So, and we were discussing your the last piece in Hermitage, the collection of stories.
Yeah.
Annie, and
Yeah.
that was very moving, and you clarified for me the other day that it was in fact a memoir piece, right?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I had no intention of making it seem like a story. It's just that I am a writer of short stories and novellas and so on. So when I structure something, it will be arranged in a certain way that perhaps has an aesthetic that resembles fiction. And of course, the only way that I can admit to fictionalizing anything at all is when two critics in Pakistan rather insisted on calling it semi-fiction. And when I said it wasn't, they said, but what about the dialogue? How can you remember dialogue so well? Well, both Quratullah and Haider, about whom the story is, and myself have a way of, fairly accurately remembering dialogue. And I think in a lot of biographies and autobiographies, dialogue is recreated. So, okay, we can use fictional techniques in a pure memoir, if there's any such thing. That's to answer part of your question. But yeah, my intention was certainly not to write a semi-autobiographical story. It's as true to fact as I can make it. It needed research. It needed my diaries of the time. It needed moments where I had to admit to a flaw or a gap in memory. I didn't fill any of the gaps with imaginary events, which is what one does in a fictionalized, or a semi-autobiographical narrative. So it's just an account of one relationship with a particularly influential and inspiring personality who happened to be a public personality. And I had, the pleasure and the joy of knowing her personally and seeing aspects of her life that weren't visible to the public.
Yes, and it was a very moving piece. And would you say that we can use fiction techniques in personal narratives? That's also very interesting. So you can use a lot of storytelling techniques in that kind of narrative as well to make it more creative.
Yeah, there's a spectrum and a range. There's a whole school of thinking and creative writing groups that feels that you can fictionalize things in what you call a memoir. You can change names and so on and so forth. I feel that you have to be very careful when you do that. But fictional techniques, yeah, like flashbacks or reconstruction of dialogue, as I said, or trying as hard as possible as you can to remember a particular scene. Because of course it may be that you sit with someone who tells you actually the sky wasn't as blue as you described it that day, it was cloudy. But that's, you see, memory playing the storyteller, allowing memory to play the storyteller.
Allow memory to play the storyteller. That's beautiful. You spoke a little bit about diary writing when we were speaking about Heather. They are also to keep a diary this semester and write in it regularly, and some of them find it daunting or too time consuming a task. Could you tell them the value of keeping a diary?
You know, my diary, since I became professional as a writer, since I started publishing books, has really been restricted largely to dates and very, very, very sketchy accounts of events, just to make sure that I remember where I was when. And I realized that for 2 years, when I didn't have one, I was actually shaky about what happened at what point. I mean, during the pandemic, I didn't keep a diary. And in this moment, I don't know what I did in July and what I did in August, because all the months seem to blend into each other. And, you know, there were certain very, very significant things that happened in my life, but I can't tell you exactly what week or what day they happened. I think a diary is very important for me for that. But of course, other people keep a journal which records their feelings and, you know, can serve as a kind of a wellspring of inspiration for a story of any kind, because you can record images, feelings, events, etc. So I think, yeah, there are many different purposes a diary or a journal can serve. I don't necessarily feel, you know, that you have to keep one for those who remember things out of sequence. I think somewhere in my new book, Restless, I have an account of a friend who tells me, why do you remember things? Why do you need to remember things the way they happened, on the day they happened, the month and the day and the year? Why don't you just remember them, you know, as a film in which scenes run into each other? Because that's the way he remembers things. So that's one way of doing it as well. And for that, maybe you need no diary, or you need an undated diary. You know, you just need a journal in which you write down those impressions and those feelings and those images. But for me, it's to preserve chronologies. So in fact, it is, in a sense, an autobiographical impulse to keep, you know, to keep control of my life, to keep a record of my life and my movements more than anything. And oddly enough, you know, I'll tell you something, Fatma, that when I have written something down in a diary and lost that diary, I'm more likely to remember exactly what month a certain thing happened. It's when I don't keep one at all that I really can't remember whether it was June or July or August, you know.
Okay. Moving on, how about writer's block? If the students suffer a writer's block, is there such a thing at all? And how can they confront it?
Frankly, I don't believe in writer's blocks. I've always found the question very difficult. But I'm personally a very lazy writer, or I'm not very motivated. I feel no need to write every day. I feel no need to express myself through writing all the time. Either I write because I'm forced to, which is most of the time. You know, like you talked about Annie, that was a commission. Once I start writing, I'm really kind of, you know, taken up by the act. And when I do sit down to write, it's really often something I've been carrying around for a long time. But for me, the block is just pure laziness. Very occasionally, depending on the genre, if it's a column, like I write a column for Dawn that's used to be every 3 months, now it suddenly seems to have become every 2 months. I sometimes sit and, you know, try to work out what I should write about. But that's not because I'm short of subjects, it's because I have too many. You know, what sort of comes to me is I'm not quite sure what I should sit down and write. So at the moment, I'm playing with 4 different ideas for a column I have to sit and write before I leave for Pakistan in 10 days' time, 9 days' time. So yeah, for me, blocks have to do with laziness, unwillingness, uncertainty, lack of belief in the value of what you want to do. But just start from anywhere. I mean, you know, the way you said, write a childhood memory, write a recent memory. Their life writing becomes very useful. Personal narratives become very useful. Write another version of a story that you know. Take a character from a television serial, perhaps, or a book that you've just read, and try to tell their story from someone else's point of view. You know, the famous example being White Sargasso Sea, which tells the story of Jane Eyre from the point of view of the mad woman in the attic. There are all these little tricks that can work. But for me, in itself, a block doesn't exist. It's, as I said, my own disinclination to write.
Okay, thank you. Those were interesting techniques as well. And so let's move on. Let's talk about titles.
Uh,
Titles for
Yeah.
their and I have been moved by several of your titles. For example, The Wounded Swan, Sound of Absence, The Man Who Stood Still. How do you arrive at it? Is there a process? Is it before or after the story? And what advice can you give the students about
each one of those titles has a story attached to it. And in fact, you've chosen quite well. The Man Who Stood Still, I think I pretty much knew that was what was going to be called. It came to me with the title, or by the time I had written the third section, I knew that this was the title. And it's probably a line from the story, but it was definitely there. Then you mentioned one other one, and then you mentioned The Wounded Swan. Tell me the other one you mentioned.
Sound of Absence.
The Sound of Absence. Yeah, the story was originally called An Absence. Then somebody told me that a famous writer, Austrian writer called Peter Handke had a book called Absence. So, not to call it Absence, or not to have the word absence. And I called it with great difficulty. We searched for a title, my then publisher and we came up with Mirror to the Sun. I was never quite happy with that title because people found it confusing and said mirrors of the sun, a mirror and the sun, etc., etc. Finally, when we came to Cactus Town with Muniza Shamsi, I decided I would call it The Sound of Absence because the story is about that, isn't it? Largely. Sorry, let me turn off this phone. It is about the sound of absence. It's about a relationship that has to be conducted in absentia. The Wounded Swan is much more complicated, Fatma. That's an Urdu story that's translated by my publisher from Urdu into English. And in Urdu, the story is called Maya or Hans. And for some reason, we decided in English not to call it Maya and the Swan. We called it the Wounded Swan. But I really don't know whether she chose that title or whether I did. It just seemed right to me. It just seemed absolutely right. But these are the titles that you've talked to me about, which are serendipitous in my work. There are other stories which have just been titled totally by happenstance because I really didn't know what to call the story at all, or even what to call the book. They haven't come easily to me. Like another Gulmohar tree, I would have called the book Puzzled Angels, and then my then editor didn't like angels in any title. Story I wrote in Insomnia, which was called The Angelic Disposition in the printed version, was actually called The Peacock and the Angel. And then again, I retitled it The Peacock and the Angel was printed. But I would say that generally I'm extremely bad at titles. 20% of the time, they just come to me along with the story or along with the book. And when it comes to putting a book together, very often when we have the title for the book, that's when I know the book is ready for publication.
So it seems to be at one end a careful, like with your publisher, you worked at it, and at the same time it has a kind of quality which is spontaneous as well.
Yeah.
And it has to just be right. It has to fit. It has to.
Yeah. It could be a variety of things. Like I think Love in the Seasons, I always knew. No, I'm sorry, I didn't. I started that story with the last line. It was the editor of the magazine that called it Love in the Seasons. So you see, sometimes I'll ask someone, what do you think I should call this? So yeah, there are various ways. But yeah, maybe the further I go, I find it easier to title my stuff. But originally it was hell. And stories have changed titles several times. Right. The best thing is to choose an image from the story, whether it's a personal narrative. Like Restless was always called Restless. I never had any doubts about that. That piece is called Restless, and it's from a line by Faiz Ahmad Faiz, which actually disappeared from I think it disappeared from the final version of the story, but it's actually inspired by either a Nazm or a Ghazal of Faiz's that I read when I was 16.
Actually, the first time you mentioned the word restless in the title story, it is a reference to Fez.
That's it. That's it.
Yes. So your
Guys whom I loved. I
story.
mean, he was the inspiring genius of my teens, you know. And then finally meeting him was absolutely marvelous as well. So
Yeah, tell us about that. How was the meeting?
oh, it was amazing because you know I was at the house of someone who was a singer, and I was suddenly told that Fez Chacha, as they called him, was going to visit, and there I was. And he appeared, and of course, you know, I had adored his work for several years. I was about 19, 20, yeah, pushing 20, I think. And then these young women sang, and they insisted that I sing, and I'm not Punjabi. I don't have one drop of Punjabi from anywhere. My father's Sindhi, but I don't speak Sindhi. My mother comes from North India. But for some reason, I was prevailed upon to sing a Bulle Shah Kafi. And Faiz looks at me and he said, "Acha gaate ho, lehja meetha hai zara." You know, my accent was obviously not quite as sharp as a Punjabi accent ought to be. But then we had wonderful meetings after that. I met him several times, and it was not at all, you know, like meeting anyone grandiloquent or the great poet of Pakistan or anything. One asked him very personal things and he answered. Like I remember, you know, he was very, very, very keen on the idea of a shared Islamic history and culture, and how, you know, even from a secular point of view, we should always reclaim that culture, and you know how to counteract Orientalist kinds of, you know, visions of the self with a sense of heritage. And I think it's no small coincidence that he was a friend of Edward Said. So yeah, it was wonderful to know him.
Talking about singing, you mentioned singing, and there's reference to it in your works as well. They move there's such high notes in some of them. Again, man who stood still. Again, sound of absence, and like it takes you to another level. And what we were talking earlier, soul bearing, and of course it's fictionalized, but it's very, very high. So do you think that your understanding of singing has contributed to that, being able to hit such high notes?
Oh, I don't think so. I know so. I know so, absolutely. I mean, you know, it's again, the two things go very closely together. My first impulse is a lyrical one. I mean, you know, I grew up listening to my mother singing beautifully. And I mean, we shared something that she could never sing professionally, though she sang in public, but, you know, it could never be a profession because of the kind of family we came from. And I never sang professionally beyond a certain point because I was too afraid. I had stage fright. I really suffered from stage fright. So at the age of 30, I decided I'll never sing again in public and started writing instead. And I've never regretted that decision. But, you know, that was the impulse. Yeah. Yeah. More than reading novels and more than reading stories, I think it was singing. I remember the first short story I wrote that I was really happy with when I was 30 years old then. And it was inspired by, you know, a Hindi wedding song. Aamer Hussein, Lucky Babul, Kahe ko pyai vides. And you know, that was spinning around in my head about these women trapped in a big haveli, and the little boy, the young man of the family, was allowed to go out and, you know, wander around town on a bicycle, but the young women were just kind of sitting around and waiting to, rather like Chekhovian heroines, waiting to be invited to a bigger town. And their mother was, you know, as it were, symbolized in this song that I had grown up hearing, which we all know from weddings, but we hardly bother to listen to the words of that, you know. So also, of course, the bilingualism of my kind of relationship with music was also very had a huge influence. That obviously I thought of English as my first language, was the language I grew up with, but I had been listening to songs in our native languages, if you want to call them that, in our vernaculars from a very early age.
So again,
and that sense of the vernacular language came into the stories. Also French, Italian, everything. Yeah. All the languages I speak. And I think I speak 5 or 6. So.
Wow, yeah. So many languages. And
Yeah, I'm very
So,
fluent with Italian. I'm trilingual now with English, Urdu, and Italian. So, and then French is a close fourth.
and I believe you recommend also, I've heard in your other talks, you recommend that we should read other writers, other cultures for short stories if we want to get to know that genre better, like
Oh yeah,
Chinese.
absolutely. It's just such a problem that people don't bother, enough with translation, or bother with, working hard enough to make translations more than readable, to make them aesthetic objects in their own right, rather than just, renditions of other things. Like, for example, in Restless, the second piece, I originally wrote in Urdu, and my editor and publisher, Shabano Alvi, translated it into English. And she forgot to put at the end of the story that was her translation. And no one's noticed that it's a translation.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So I also didn't notice that. So I'll go home and go over it again and see.
Yeah, you quoted from it in your review of my book, I think.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yes.
Teacher.
Oh, teacher. Yes, I remember teacher. And so we meet there's a sage you quote in there that we meet 9 12 teachers in our life, and one of them is. And sometimes you quote these sages even in other parts of Restless. There's a wise man. There's a wise man who curses in one of the instances as well.
Oh, he wasn't a wise man. He was a charlatan.
He was a charlatan. Okay.
Yeah, he used to stand at our door and shout, "So, dunya fani hai," and terrify us.
He's a wise man.
I mean, the whole world is going to fade away with what he was shouting. Probably was predicting a pandemic. He was frightening. I don't think he was a sage. I think he was, terror.
Okay. I took it in the context that if the curse comes from the so-called wise man, you have to be careful of that. Like that was.
Well, he was certainly dressed up as a wise man.
Yes. Okay. So any other things that I might have? Let me just see. So any other writers that you would recommend for them to be reading at their age?
Oh, personal narratives.
Or any other writers, even stories or fiction. What should they like? Any recommendations from you?
I'm trying to think. Gosh, I've just got such a wide range of books and narratives I like. I'm trying to I'm wondering what's available in Pakistan, and what's. I mean, obviously, among our best writers of personal narratives are Sara Suleiri and Meatless Days and Boys Will Be Boys. I think are a great place to begin. And she's the one who really comes to mind as a writer of personal narratives in English in Pakistan.
Okay.
Other writers I like, short story writers. I like the writers of the American South, like Eudora Welty, Catherine Ann Porter, but they're of another time, they're of the 40s and 50s. Novels, one of my favorites is, I was mentioning White Sargasso Sea by Jean Rhys. I think you should also try to read, novels from Africa, like the works of Chinua Achebe or Ngugi wa Thiong'o, or works from Japan, Tanizaki. I think most of them are available in Pakistan because they're all Penguin, Penguin classics, which I think are widely distributed everywhere. And try to look for our own writers. They're hard to find. It's sad that so many Pakistani writers who were published in the 50s and 60s and 70s have kind of disappeared. Ahmad Ali, Zebunissa Hamidullah, Mumtaz Shahnawaz. Their books come into print for one edition and then they vanish.
Yes,
Shaista Ikramullah wrote a very, very fine historical autobiography called From Parda to Parliament, which is about women emerging literally from Parda to Parliament. And that's part of our national history, not just part of literature. So Yeah, I guess the list is endless.
Yes, thank you for those. I'm sure some of them will read. Um, and let's open it to questions from the class. Would anyone like, yes, Rafe has a question. Just speak.
Uh, Hi, sir. You mentioned about your ability, about your skills of polylinguality and how you're trilingual. So I want to ask if you write in other languages, and if you don't, then why do you mainly choose to write in English? You consider it the most language.
I chose to write in English because it wasn't a choice. I was educated in English from the age of 5, I believe. And because I had 2 older sisters, they were already in the English stream and, speaking in English and talking about English books. So we got a lot of English books around. I've written a piece in my new book in Restless about how I would have loved to be able to read stories for children in Urdu at the age when I was reading English books. I had to catch up later. I don't write only in English. I've written a book in Urdu. It came out last year called Zindagi Se Pehle. It's a collection of stories. I started writing it in 2012, I believe. So it took me 7 years to complete a collection in Urdu because I was doing so much else at the time. But that was actually occasioned by personal narrative, because when a friend suggested that I should write in Urdu, the first 2 stories that came to me were memories of friends who had died within the last 8 or 10 or 5 years from that time. And then the wonderful Asif Farruhi, who died last year, told me, can you write 5 of these and I'll publish them in my magazine, Dunya Azad, which is a very good Urdu magazine. So I wrote those 5. And then it was left there. And a couple of years later, someone else said, would you write an Urdu story? So again, it was semi-fiction. But I mean, those stories that I wrote for Asif really had a very strong basis in my own experience. So somehow when I write in Urdu, I tend to go very much to my own experience. Italian, I can write in Italian. I mean, I can write a little essay or something like that. But the fact is that Italian doesn't contain my experience. Italian doesn't have a connection with Pakistan. The first 15 years of my life were mostly in Pakistan, and several months or even a year at one point in India. So, my experience is very deeply rooted in Pakistani, Indian, South Asian history. And Italian doesn't convey that at all. But last year I had an experiment of translating directly 2 stories for children from Italian into Urdu without using an English dictionary or an English version or anything like that. And that was quite a marvelous kind of experience. Otherwise, yeah, I've dabbled in writing in Italian, but those are the 2 languages. English and Urdu are the 2 languages that I feel easiest writing in. And people keep asking me what qualities there are in Urdu that I relish more than English. One is, I think, what can be quite an unbridled lyricism. One is a dryness, which is quite the opposite of lyricism, but it's concise, it can be terse, it can be short. And the third that other people notice is that my Urdu has in it more humor and a different kind of humor from the English stories that I write. So I hope that answers your question to an extent. And I think, again, if I were to write in 3 languages, I feel life is really too short to write in 3 languages. But English, I repeat, is really not a question of choice. I started writing in English because it was the only language I knew well enough to write in. I was improving my Urdu all along the way by reading it and, by studying it and so on and so forth. And the minute I felt that I had a certain degree of, fluency in the ability to write Urdu, I started to write in Urdu. Talking about writer's block, one of the reasons why I didn't start writing in Urdu was that I had read too much in Urdu. I was completely, terrified by the grand narratives I had read in Urdu, the great writers like Aamer Hussein, the older ones like Nazir Ahmad, or the poets like Ghalib and Faiz and Mir and everyone. And I thought Urdu is just this language of grand writers. Nobody wrote mediocre or bad Urdu. It was when I picked up a few bad Urdu novels from a library or from the airport and read those, badly written, sloppy, I won't mention the names of the writers, but they're mostly writers on whose books these TV serials are based. And I said, oh, God, I can do much better than this. And I sat down and wrote. And mostly people liked what I wrote. Finally, I had enough stories for a book, and there it was.
Nice. Next question. Anyone else? Yes, Talal, a question.
You spoke about songs and music being probably your number one impulse that you acted upon when you were writing. I would like to know more about it as a young songwriter myself. How advised me to capture my feelings and put them in the songs. You also mentioned you sharing a song with your mother that she wrote herself. And also, I would also like to ask that, have you ever written any other originals after that, sharing that with your mother?
No, I didn't share a song with my mother that she wrote herself. It was a folk song. It was a Shadi Ka Gana by Aamer Hussein, from the traditional vocabulary. No, I'm not a very good lyricist. I mean, I do write poetry sometimes. There's one short kind of poetic narrative in this. But I do think that when you write songs in English,
Urdu and English both. Sometimes in a single song, both languages.
yeah, you see, English has the ability to allow you to write narrative in a song as well. If you listen to the work of people like Joni Mitchell, the song is often a short story. It will tell you an incident in the way a short story or a poem will. But of course, songs like poems also allow you to express lyricism, feeling in a way that a short story won't. I mean, a song can be completely based on one sustained feeling or scattered feelings, whereas a story needs a narrative line. A song can have a narrative line, but usually doesn't.
I would just like to add something. You say that you do not write poetry, but I would argue that some of the pieces, like 9 postcards and some pieces other in Man Who Stood Still and Wounded Swan and even February, it's so poetic. The language is so poetic. As I said, it reaches that element in your fiction writing as well.
Yeah, I think that is the lyrical impulse, but I don't deliberately try to be poetic. You are catching on to a lot of things, Fatma, that that are very pertinent. 9 postcards was actually written as a poem on the back of a napkin or something like that. I was sitting at breakfast in Andalusia in southern Spain, in the place I described. And it was like, notes. And of course, notes can be very similar to poetry in that they just, try to sum things up in brief lines. And then I looked at it and I said, oh, I can make a story of this. So that was originally a poem. Some kind of poem. Yeah. The Wounded Swan, of course, is translated again by Shabano Alvi. It's not my work. I wrote it in Urdu. There is an English version of it called The Swan's Wife, which is very different from the Urdu. But so that lyricism that is in the English version is Shabano Alvi's version of my Urdu.
Oh, in Wounded Swan. Okay.
Yeah. And I think it did describe, it probably derives its lyricism very much from the park and the water and so on that I'm describing, where I've taken a real place in Urdu. I've fictionalized it. So it's Regent's Park, which is near my house. But I call it Sabzbar or something like that, symbolic title in Urdu. So the whole Urdu story is full of symbols that are lost in English because, of course, Maya means illusion in Sanskrit and Hindi. And Sabzbar, evergreen garden, but it also has this connotation of Sabzbar Dikhana, which is actually leading people astray, etc., etc. So that whole story is about illusion, which perhaps is a poetical conceit.
Yes. Any other questions? Anyone else? Okay, Rahul, yes.
Yes, you mentioned that sometimes laziness or lack of motivation can overcome a writer. You talk about how you yourself express those emotions. I mean, personally, being a student, frankly, sometimes anything that motivates me is the deadline of the assignment itself. So I want to ask you, what personally drives you or motivates you to write? What's the inspiration behind your writing itself?
I think I said, but I'll repeat it. I think that it's mostly when an editor, a friend, just gets on my back and insists that I finish something, or someone chases me around with a deadline. And I also belong to a group of writers. There are just 3 of us now. We started off as 7, I think, who read stories to each other. And since the other 2 are always going to have something ready, either a chapter of a book or a poem or something like that, I feel then compelled to work on something. And in that, then I have the freedom of genre. I might take, this is something else you can do, I think, to perhaps break down a barrier that you might call, writer's block, and translate something from one language into another. So in fact, I took 2 short stories that a young friend of mine who writes in Urdu had written and translated them into English. And that was one way around, not wanting to write something original. Or I also retell stories from Attar and Rumi, which I read in Persian, and then, write simple modern versions of them for young people or for a general audience. All these things can, help you escape from this feeling that you have nothing left to say. Because coming back to what Fatma asked to begin with about why is writing important? Writing is important because reading is important. Yeah, please, Fatma. I
As a group of writers that you guys were, I think they can also take inspiration from that and actually work in groups and find other students who are interested in things they are and make a group like that and do readings and so on. Any other questions? Yes.
Sir, I want to ask how your university life shaped you as a writer.
I'm sorry?
How your university life shaped you as a writer?
That's a very interesting question. I didn't feel it did. I mean, I completely stopped writing when I was studying at university because I studied Persian grammar and linguistics for 2 years. I thought it would be literature, but it wasn't. And then I did 1 year of Urdu literature, which was wonderful, but was mostly classical poetry, which, as I told you, is quite scary. And also Siraiki poetry. I did my dissertation on Khader Ghulam Farid. So I completely stopped writing at that time. But many, many years later, when I wrote my novel, The Cloud Messenger, about 1/3 of that novel is actually based on my university life. And when I look back, I realized that had I not studied the Urdu classics, I wouldn't be the writer I am. Because unlike many Anglophone writers in Pakistan or India or the subcontinent or any post-colonial country, I'm not influenced in the same way by the English canon. I'm not influenced by reading Dickens or Jane Austen or the Brontes or Hardy. Nothing, not at all. Nor does the English poetic canon, which I quite like, have any influence on me. But 19th century literature, nothing, absolutely zero, minus zero. So in that sense, yeah, university was a great influence.
So you're saying university is not relevant when you want to be a writer?
No, he's saying it came back in the novel that he wrote, all the university experience, not at that time. So everything in life, I would just add to that everything in life is a possible situation that you can take to writing even many years later.
Yeah, but what I'm also saying is that writing that book made me realize that all through the years, I had drawn consciously and unconsciously on the Urdu and Persian canon, and not on the English canon. So in that sense, my intellect or my writing spirit had been shaped by reading in Urdu and Persian and Siraiki.
Right. Any other questions? Yes, Sarwar.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but in the beginning you said that fiction can never be different from what your memory tells you. That memory and fiction are always connected.
Yeah, they're always connected. I'm not saying they can't be different. They can be very, very different. Because you can take a memory and turn it upside down. But what I'm saying is that your imagination, I think the point I was trying to make was that your imagination is material. It's not just abstract. Imagination derives from, your experience of a lifetime, whether that's what you see, what you feel, what you live through, or what you read or what you watch.
Okay. The online class, does anyone have a question? No, I think those have been answered. Anyone else have a question? The online class? And anyone else from here? Yes, Rafi?
You mentioned something which I found very interesting. You said, and I quote, that in a sense, everything is autobiographical. Can you please emphasize more on that point?
Yeah, that's a question. That's just an answer that one gives to people who say nothing is autobiographical. So it's just a tautology. If somebody says nothing is autobiographical, I say everything is autobiographical, because as I said, everything derives from what we see or what we feel, from our perception, you know. Now, the other day I was reading from a surah in the Quran, which said we gave you eyes to see and a tongue, you know, to declare things. So that is what we used to write from, you know. What we see and what we can say, the story we can tell, and the images we observe. In that sense, everything is autobiographical, but that doesn't really mean that we're always writing about ourselves. We're writing about the experiences we've lived through and how we transform them, and how far we try to escape from them. You know, this desire to write science fiction or fantasy, or to go far beyond your own experience, still has to be inspired by your connection with, you know, a generic category. You know, what are you going to write as science fiction? It'll still have some inspiration from what you've read or what you've seen. And you'll still have something to say, which you want to express from your inner being or from your intellect. I hope that answered your question.
We have a question from Muhammad Saad, and he says, what do you think we should do to make our mundane experiences into interesting writing?
Yeah, my sister and my niece always had something to say about that. My late sister used to say that you write these experiences. She was only a year younger than I was. She says, you write these experiences that I remember just as well as you do. But when I remember them, they just seem like everyday trivia. And when you write them, you make them magical. And now my niece is reading my book, and she says this, oh, it's just finished reading my book, and she says the same thing. I don't think that anything is trivial, really. I think everything has its own magic. I think that the mundane is just as magical as the magical. I really do. I love small details, and that's the kind of small detail that can enrich any kind of writing in any genre, you know, whether it's fiction or life writing. It makes it look, to use that term, hackneyed term, realistic.
Right. So if there are no more questions, I have one last question. You have written so much over the years. Like, how has the journey been? How has it been being a writer?
Paradoxical, because I never took myself seriously as a writer when I began. I just did what I wanted to do. Then one day I had enough stories to start sending them out to publish, or people saw them and liked them and wanted to publish them. Then they started to say to me, there has to be a book, there has to be a book, which was hard because it took about a year. And, you know, people weren't really ready to take a risk on a collection of short stories. But I was very ensconced in a teaching life, and I wasn't that bothered. Once I wrote the first book, I think I wanted to continue on that route. And the second book took a very long time to publish. But after that, 1999, the second book came out. It's been a series of, you know, encouragements from publishers or friends or readers. So I've been able to live 2 or 3 lives, you know, in parallel, running together. So I wouldn't say it's been difficult. I think actually sometimes finding the time to finish a book, or to put a collection together, or even to finish writing a story if I was in the middle of, you know, marking papers or supervising PhD students, was hard. And sometimes even running around the world, or certainly 4 or 5 countries, publicizing your books can take away a lot of time from the actual writing. But I'd say my journey has been, you know, kind of paradoxical is the only word I can use, yeah. And I repeat, I never took myself hugely seriously. I mean, I'm just quickly translating something Quratullah and Heather said to me once about a grand old man of Urdu literature. In Urdu, she said it, but I'll say it in English. But, these writers are so arrogant about what they write that we write, thumping their chests. And she says, you write, I write, so what? And I think that's the paradox. We do what we do, and we try to do it as well as we can. But I don't think that writers are the arbiters of the universe. We just, we bear witness to what we see and what we feel.
Bear witness to what we see and what we feel. Thank you, Aamer. Thank you so much for joining us. And I think the students will have learned a lot over here, and it's whether they realize it or not, it's one of the shaping moments for them, I feel. Thank you so much for joining us.
Many thanks. Many thanks. It's always a delight to share things. I've been to the IBA several times in person, and it's nice to revisit even virtually. So.
Yes, I will share the. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
You can close the recording.